Here in my hand, I'm holding perhaps one of the most beloved novels in history, The Hobbit. Published in 1932, The Hobbit has gone on to become the world's sixth best-selling individual novel. The story was continued in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and then in a collection of posthumously collected works. Tolkien's creations may have withstood the test of time, but the format in which his works were presented have their own story to tell. Our modern world takes the novel for granted, assuming its ubiquity, when its prominence is in fact a relatively recent affair. Historians have never perfectly pinpointed the moment the novel sprang into existence. This can be attributed to the preliminary difficulty in trying to figure out exactly what a novel is. The word first appeared in the English language in the 1560s in relation to a fictional prose narrative. The word originated from the Italian novella, itself from Latin novellus, literally meaning new thing. Originally, however, the word would have referred to a short story in a great collection, such as those of Boccaccio in the Decameron. It was only in the late 1630s that the word was used in its modern sense to describe a lengthy work, which would have earlier been referred to as a romance. How should we define a novel? Ultimately, it is a specific concept and difficult to define. However, I consider the true novel to have a few defining characteristics. A novel must be written in prose. This allows for the intimate understanding of a character's mind. A novel must be fictional, but it may be realistic or fantastical. A novel must have a narrative, that is, a story must be told. A novel must be long. A short work is a novella, which itself is a loanword from the original Italian. A novel must be written with the intent of publication, whether or not it ultimately was published. The first entirely surviving work that matches most of these criteria can be traced to the dying days of Hellenistic Greece during the 1st century AD. Calirrhoe was written by Charitron, a Greek native to Aphrodisias in western Anatolia. However, as the work was not published for another 1,600 years, it cannot be defined as a true novel, and there is no proof that Charitron did intend to publish the work. A closer match would perhaps be The Tale of Genji, written by Japanese lady-in-waiting Lady Murasaki. The advent of movable type printing technology in Northern Song allowed for the spread of books in their modern definition. Japan's long history of woodblock printing led to the proliferation of the early novel. The book was entirely written in fictional prose, featured a narrative, and was an expansive work. The book was published in the first couple of decades in the 11th century. The Tale of Genji is especially fascinating in its social context, leading to it being written entirely in phonetic characters over logographic characters, and using mostly native Japanese words over loans from Chinese. The Tale of Genji continues to be the pinnacle of Japanese literature to this day. The modern novel evolved after the introduction of the printing press. Two formats rose to prominence in England. Firstly, the chapbook, a cheap, crudely made booklet, and secondly, the belles lettres, which composed of fine, artistic writing. The proliferation of cheap books and pamphlets rapidly increased the accessibility of the educated class to works of fact and works of fiction. This separation of academic history and fiction was also a key distinction that contributed to the rise of novels. European chivalric romance had been popular during the High Medieval period, but fell out of fashion by the year 1600 as the height of the Renaissance swept through Europe. Thus rose the satirical romance, a genre that peaked in the 16th and 17th centuries, in reaction to the chivalric romance, which had dried up due to an established disinterest in epic poetry in the late 17th century. Contemporary critics view the new format as succinct, fresh, and engaging. In the year 1605, a Spaniard by the name of Miguel de Cervantes chose the chivalric romance as a model for his satirical novel, Don Quixote. The novel recounts the adventures of a member of the Spanish gentry who who enters a state of insanity that compels him to embark on an adventure to revive chivalry. The book's interpretation has evolved. Upon publication, the book was interpreted as a comic novel. The late 18th century reinvented the novel's purpose as a social commentary concerning the battle between man and society. The critics of the 19th century took the novel as a tragedy of man whose idealism is defeated by reality. Ultimately, the book is the first European novel, and the first novel to pose a lasting alternative to the predominant chivalric romance. The Augustan literary period, which lasts from the start of Queen Anne's reign to the death of Alexander Pope in 1745, saw the rise of the epistolary novel. By the year 1700, reading was no longer an aristocratic privilege. An appetite for scandal and gossip starting in the 1680s led to the introduction of the epistolary novel, represented at its earliest stage by the anonymously published Love Letters Between a Nobleman and His Sister, which saw publication between 1684 and 1687 in 3 separate volumes. One of the first English novels to be awarded note was Pamela, an epistolary novel by Samuel Richardson, published in 1740. In the fashion of educated society in 18th century England, and their focus on the novel as a format designed for vivid, uproarious entertainment, Pamela recounts the story of a 15-year-old maidservant whose employer makes inappropriate advances towards her. Unsurprisingly, the epistolary novel was increasingly ridiculed from the mid-18th century, starting with Henry Fielding's Shamala, a parody of Richardson's bestseller. The Augustan age had seen the explosion of satire as a genre of its own. Despite this, as with chivalric romance, the heightened satirization of the epistolary novel was a sign that it was in decline. Pamela, however, is often considered the first English novel, over the earlier Robinson Crusoe, written in 1719. This is in part due to Robinson Crusoe being more reminiscent of a romance rather than novels of the time. Novels in the 18th century had a narrower definition, as novels had to be set in the real, often fashionable world. 18th century novels placed importance on a morally ambiguous hero, wit in writing, a concise plot, and scandalous stories. Robinson Crusoe featured a heroic protagonist, fantastic elements, and an exotic locale. It was thus considered romance in prose. The rise of the romantic novel complicated the category's traditional definition. The romantic period lasted much of the 19th century, and it was characterized by a focus on emotion, individualism, and it romanticized the medieval period over the classicalism of the early modern era. The Gothic novel simultaneously rose with Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto. Sir Walter Scott, perhaps unknowingly, led the movement to reclaim romance for the novel. Scott himself focused on historical romance. Of his 27 books, only 1 was set in the modern day. 16 of his books were set in Scotland, utilising uniquely Scottish themes and stories. For example, Waverley was set during the Jacobite uprising of 1745. Ivanhoe, on the other hand, was set during 12th century England and soon came to influence the modern perception of the Middle Ages, pioneering many tropes now considered part of the fantasy genre. Ivanhoe also introduced Robin Hood to romantic audiences. Sir Walter was not entirely familiar with medieval history, often stringing together Elizabethan and Jacobean speech to create an artificial register, and his stories were more fiction than fact many times. Despite this, his works were unique in that they paid attention to historical reality. That is, the stories were weaved into real-life events and featured real-life characters. Waverley was particularly significant in this trend. Sir Walter had combined historical documentary with a deeper imaginative and emotional significance. The birth of the Victorian novel also coincided with a general shift in the relationship between author and reader. The demand for popular fiction skyrocketed, whilst institutions such as circulating libraries and copyright laws provided writing much more profitable pursuit. The Victorian age was also a time of exploration for the novelist, where stories were often written from different perspectives than they were in previous years. For example, Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment was written from the perspective of a criminal. Controversial topics of the time were frequently featured in the Victorian novel, such as industrialization, Darwin's theory of evolution, and class division. The modernist novel is personified by James Joyce's Ulysses, which utilized a unique stream of consciousness method that recorded the character's thoughts, as opposed to the 18th and 19th century's narrator. Whereas the 19th century was shaped by peace and development in Europe, the 20th century was shaped by war, destruction, and totalitarianism. Authors came from a wide range of backgrounds. Eric Remarque related experience from the First World War and its aftermath. Fitzgerald examined the Jazz Age, and Steinbeck explored the Great Depression. George Orwell's most famous novel, 1984, focuses on the topic of totalitarianism, introducing words such as doublethink, thought crime, and Big Brother. Postmodernism, the following trend, sought to deconstruct and subvert existing notions of the novel, mirrored by the post-colonial novel, which applied a similar procedure to deconstruct Western attitudes to the novel. The modern novel, however, is most closely aligned with the phenomenon of genre fiction, which is the modern successor of the early modern chapbook. Science fiction, fantasy, spy thrillers, modern romance, and dystopias have all been delineated by the publishing industry, as well as the demographic categories of children, young adult, and adult fiction. The Lord of the Rings saga, the Harry Potter series, James Bond, and the Hunger Games are all examples of the popular fiction of the modern era. The future of the novel will be especially interesting to watch, as the playing field has started to shift. Audiobooks, self-publishing, and ebooks are all innovations that have rapidly come to prominence in recent times. It is worth appreciating the novel in its breadth and growth throughout its centuries of existence, and its immense value to the history of humanity will absolutely continue for centuries to come.